The desert stretched infinitely, a vast expanse of crimson sand under a sky that seemed to pulse with heat. Yasir squinted into the distance, wiping sweat from his brow. The dunes rose and fell like frozen waves, the horizon shimmering as if the world itself were melting. "This better not be another one of your wild goose chases," he muttered, his voice dry like the desert air. He adjusted his scarf and glanced at Layla, who was poring over a yellowed map. Layla's face lit up with determination, a stark contrast to Yasir's skepticism. "This isn't just a story, Yasir. The manuscript described this place perfectly. The village is here, buried beneath these dunes. I know it." "Or it's just another mirage," Hamza quipped, his voice laced with sarcasm. He was already regretting agreeing to this trip, hating the heat, the sand, and the endless monotony of the desert. Amal, ever the optimist, was busy setting up her camera. "Whether we find something or not, this is going to make an amazing documentary. Imagine, uncovering a lost civilization right here in the empty quarter." Faisal, the oldest of the group, adjusted his wide-brimmed hat and stroked his beard. "There are many legends about this place," he said thoughtfully. "The Bedouins spoke of a village swallowed by the sands overnight. They claimed it was cursed. Of course, there's no historical evidence to back it up, but there's always a but," Hamza interrupted, rolling his eyes. "But," Faisal continued unfazed, "stories like these often have a kernel of truth. It's why we're here, to find out what really happened." Their convoy of 3 4x4s had stopped at a point marked on Layla's map. The coordinates aligned perfectly with the clues she had painstakingly pieced together from fragments of ancient texts. The depression in the sand hinted at something unnatural, something waiting to be unearthed. As the group unloaded their gear, the desert fell eerily silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself was aware of their intrusion. By the second day of digging, the group was exhausted but exhilarated. The heat was merciless, and the sand seemed to resist their efforts, slipping back into the holes they dug. But the discoveries kept them going. Fragments of pottery, rusted tools, and the crumbled remnants of walls buried beneath centuries of shifting dunes. Layla was the most tireless of them all. Her hands blistered, but her spirit unshaken. She brushed away sand from what appeared to be the foundation of a small house, her heart racing with anticipation. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "We're close." Hamza, on the other hand, was less enthusiastic. "I still don't see the point," he grumbled. "So there was a village here. Big deal. People leave villages all the time. It's called history." "Not like this," Faisal interjected. He held up a fragment of pottery, its surface etched with strange symbols. "These markings don't match any known civilization in the region. This village might have been isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. That makes it unique." "Unique, sure," Hamza muttered. "Still doesn't explain why we're risking heat stroke out here." Amal ignored the bickering and focused on her camera, documenting every detail. She was determined to capture the moment they unearthed the heart of the village, the discovery that would make their expedition unforgettable. On the third day, their perseverance paid off. Beneath what appeared to be the remnants of a marketplace, they found a large stone slab, its surface engraved with the same strange symbols as the pottery. The slab was heavy, but with combined effort they managed to lift it, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The air that escaped from below was cool, but carried an unsettling metallic tang, like blood. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Only one way to find out what's down there," Layla said, grabbing a flashlight. Hamza groaned. "Why is it always the creepy underground stuff? Can't we just enjoy the sunshine for once?" Despite his protests, the group descended into the chamber. The staircase was narrow, the walls damp and covered in faint carvings. Their flashlights revealed more of the strange symbols, along with images of hooded figures kneeling before a massive serpent-like entity. "This isn't just a village," Faisal murmured. "This was a place of worship." At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a large chamber. At its center stood an altar, blackened with age. On the altar lay a rusted dagger and a scroll, its text faded but still legible. Layla reached for the scroll, but Faisal stopped her. "Careful," he warned. "This is ancient. We should document it first." As Amal began filming, a sudden gust of wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing their flashlights. The group froze, their breaths caught in their throats. "Did anyone else feel that?" Yasir whispered. Before anyone could answer, they heard it. A low, guttural whisper echoing through the chamber. The next morning, Hamza was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his belongings untouched. At first, they thought he had wandered off to relieve himself, but as the hours passed, their concern turned to panic. "Hamza!" Yasir called, his voice hoarse from shouting. They scoured the camp and the surrounding dunes, but there was no sign of him. The tracks leading away from the camp ended abruptly, as if he had simply vanished. "He wouldn't just leave," Yasir said, his voice shaking. "Something's happened to him." Layla clenched her fists, her mind racing. "It has to be connected to the chamber. Whatever's down there, it's not just history, it's something else." Amal, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "I saw something on the footage," she said hesitantly. "Figures, shadows moving in the ruins. I thought it was just a glitch, but now—" "Now what?" Faisal asked, his tone urgent. "Now I think we're being watched," she admitted. Her words sent a chill through the group. They decided to stick together, refusing to let anyone wander off alone. But that night, as they huddled in their tents, the silence of the desert was broken by faint whispers carried on the wind. Yasir lay awake, clutching a flashlight. He could hear the whispers growing louder, though he couldn't make out the words. They sounded ancient, inhuman. When he finally fell asleep, his dreams were filled with visions of hooded figures and a serpent's unblinking eyes. The next day, Faisal was the next to disappear. His notes were scattered near the chamber, along with the scroll he had been studying. Yasir picked up the scroll, his hands trembling. Among Faisal's notes was a partial translation. "The sands will reclaim all who disturb the devourer's slumber." "What does that mean?" Amal asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means we've awakened something," Layla said grimly. "And now, it's coming for us." The remaining three ventured back into the chamber, desperate for answers. Yasir carried the scroll, hoping to find clues to stop whatever was happening. As they descended the staircase, they felt the air grow colder. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift and writhe under their flashlights. When they reached the altar, Yasir placed the scroll on it. "This thing, whatever it is, it feeds on us," he said. "We need to put it back to sleep." "But how?" Amal asked, panic creeping into her voice. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them shook. The altar cracked, revealing a sinkhole that led to a massive underground cavern. In the cavern, the truth was laid bare. The skeletal remains of the village's inhabitants were piled high, their bones twisted as if in agony, and at the center of it all was the devourer. The serpent-like entity was coiled around a stone pillar, its scales shimmering with an otherworldly light. Its eyes glowed, piercing into their souls. Layla stepped forward, unable to look away. "It's been here all this time," she whispered. The devourer's gaze fixed on her, and the sand began to rise, pulling her toward the pit. She screamed, but there was no escape. The last thing Yasir saw was her terrified face as the sands consumed her. Amal tried to run but was dragged into the pit, her screams echoing in the chamber. Yasir stood frozen, paralyzed by fear and guilt. He was the only one to escape, stumbling back to civilization with the story. Yasir stumbled back into the camp, his mind reeling with terror. He could hardly process what he had seen. The image of Layla and Amal being swallowed by the sands haunted him. It was as if the desert itself was alive, feeding on their fear and flesh. He collapsed by the remnants of the fire pit, gasping for air, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The desert was silent once again, eerily so. The whispers were gone, but the silence was far more terrifying. He glanced at the scroll, now torn and smeared with blood. It had been the key to everything, and yet he had no idea how to interpret it. He knew he couldn't stay. The longer he lingered, the closer he felt the unseen presence creeping toward him. Grabbing what little water and supplies he could carry, Yasir began walking toward the last known GPS coordinates that marked their vehicles. Yasir trudged through the dunes, his body weak, his mind fractured. The sun bore down on him, but it wasn't the heat that drained him. It was the overwhelming dread. He felt as if he were being watched, the weight of unseen eyes pressing heavily on him. Every time he turned, there was nothing but sand and the endless horizon. He reached the vehicles by nightfall. 2 of the 4x4s were still there, but the third, the one Hamza had driven, was gone. Yasir's hope of leaving the cursed desert dwindled as he realized the keys to the remaining vehicles were missing. Sitting in the shadow of the truck, he replayed everything in his mind. The ancient text had warned of a devourer, an entity worshipped by the lost village. It wasn't just a metaphor or a legend, it was real. The villagers had likely made sacrifices to it, appeasing the beast with blood and devotion. When they stopped, or when something went wrong, the devourer turned on them. "Is that what happened to us?" Yasir muttered to himself. "Were we just more sacrifices?" His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps on the sand. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Slowly, he turned his head, his heart pounding in his chest. In the distance, he saw a figure, a shadowy silhouette against the pale moonlight. It was moving toward him. "Layla?" he called out weakly, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. It just kept moving closer, its gait unnatural, jerky. "Hamza? Faisal?" Still, no response. The figure stopped a few feet away, just outside the circle of moonlight that illuminated the camp. Yasir strained his eyes, trying to make out the face. When the figure stepped forward, his blood ran cold. It was Amal, or what was left of her. Her eyes were hollow sockets, her skin pale and cracked like old parchment. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a low, guttural sound emerged. Yasir stumbled backward, tripping over a rock. Amal, or the thing wearing her body, continued to advance. Behind her, more figures emerged from the darkness. Hamza, Faisal, Layla. All of them bore the same lifeless, soulless expressions. "No," Yasir whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "This isn't real! This can't be real!" He scrambled to his feet and ran. The figures didn't chase him. They simply watched as he disappeared into the dunes. Yasir ran until his legs gave out. He collapsed on the sand, gasping for air, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, and he had no idea where he was. As he lay there, he felt the ground beneath him shift. The sand seemed to ripple, as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes scanning the dunes for any sign of danger. Then he saw it. The sand directly ahead of him began to collapse, forming a massive sinkhole. From the depths emerged the devourer, its serpent-like body glistening under the moonlight. Its scales shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and its eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce Yasir's very soul. He wanted to run, but his body refused to move. He was paralyzed, trapped in the creature's gaze. The devourer let out a deafening roar, the sound vibrating through the air and shaking the very ground beneath him. Yasir fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He realized in that moment that there was no escape. The devourer wasn't just a creature. It was a force, an ancient power that thrived on fear and despair. The sand around him began to rise, coiling around his legs and pulling him toward the creature. He struggled, but it was no use. The more he fought, the tighter the sand gripped him. As he was dragged closer to the devourer, Yasir felt his mind begin to unravel. Images flashed before his eyes, the hooded figures from the carvings, the villagers screaming as the sand consumed them, his friends' lifeless faces staring back at him. And then, just as the creature opened its massive jaws, Yasir remembered the scroll. He reached into his bag and pulled it out, holding it up as a shield. The devourer paused, its eyes narrowing. The symbols on the scroll began to glow, casting an eerie light across the dunes. In that moment, Yasir understood. The scroll wasn't just a warning, it was a weapon. The ancient text contained a ritual, a way to seal the devourer and put it back to sleep. Muttering the words under his breath, Yasir felt a surge of energy course through him. The sand around him began to recede, and the devourer let out an enraged hiss. The light from the scroll grew brighter and brighter until it was blinding. The last thing Yasir saw was the devourer retreating into the earth, its roar echoing in the distance. When Yasir woke, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The howling winds, the whispers, and the nightmarish roars of the devourer were gone. The desert was eerily calm, with only the soft rustle of the morning breeze brushing over the endless sands. He blinked several times, disoriented, his mind struggling to comprehend if he was alive or if he had succumbed to the desert's horrors. The rising sun painted the horizon in hues of gold and crimson, casting long shadows over the dunes. Yasir's body ached in ways he didn't think possible. His throat was parched, his skin blistered from the relentless sun, and his limbs felt like lead. But the most haunting sensation was the emptiness around him. He was alone. The camp, the ruins, the remnants of their expedition. Everything was gone. There was no sign of Amal, Layla, Hamza, or Faisal. Even the massive sinkhole that had unleashed the devourer had vanished, the sand smooth and untouched as though the earth itself had sealed its secrets. Yasir staggered to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. His eyes darted across the horizon, desperate for any sign of life, any trace of his friends. "Layla? Amal? Hamza?" he called out, his voice cracking and weak. Only the desert answered, its silence stretching infinitely. The scroll was still clutched in his hand, its edges singed, the once glowing symbols now faint and dull. It was the only evidence that the nightmare had been real. Yasir stared at it, his fingers trembling. He could still feel its power, even though it had been used. Whatever ancient force had created it had saved him. But at what cost? Yasir began walking, his body on autopilot. He didn't know where he was headed. All he could do was move forward. The desert was a labyrinth of identical dunes, each one mocking his attempts to orient himself. The GPS tracker in his pocket was dead, its battery drained long ago. His phone had been left behind in the chaos. The memories of the night before haunted him. The faces of his friends, twisted into lifeless masks, stared back at him whenever he closed his eyes. The image of the devourer, its scales glinting like polished obsidian, was burned into his mind. As he walked, Yasir's thoughts spiraled. Was he the only one left? Had the devourer claimed his friends as sacrifices? Or had they been consumed by something even worse, lost in the folds of time, their existence erased by the curse of the buried village? Hours turned into days. Yasir's supplies ran out quickly. The water bottle he'd managed to salvage from the camp was empty, its plastic cracking under the heat. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but it was the thirst that threatened to undo him. He remembered the stories he'd heard as a child, tales of travelers who had succumbed to the desert's cruel indifference. Was this how he would end? By the third day, Yassir's body was on the verge of collapse. His vision blurred, the world around him shimmering like a mirage. He fell to his knees, the sand scorching his skin. His thoughts grew hazy, fragmented. He whispered his friends' names like a prayer, his voice hoarse and broken. Just as he felt the darkness closing in, he saw movement on the horizon. At first, he thought it was another illusion, a cruel trick played by his dehydrated mind. But as the figures grew closer, he realized they were real. A group of Bedouin nomads had spotted him. They rushed toward him, their camels kicking up plumes of sand as they approached. Strong hands lifted him from the ground, voices speaking in a language he barely registered. They gave him water, the cool liquid burning his throat as he gulped it down. Yassir's body trembled as they carried him to their camp. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind teetering on the edge of reality. He was vaguely aware of being laid on a soft mat, the smell of herbs and spices filling the air. When Yassir woke again, it was nighttime. The stars above were a glittering tapestry, their light casting a serene glow over the Bedouin camp. A fire crackled nearby, its warmth soothing against the chill of the desert night. An elderly man, the leader of the tribe, sat beside Yassir. His face was lined with years of wisdom, his eyes kind but piercing. "You're lucky we found you," the elder said in Arabic, his voice low and steady. "The desert does not often spare those it claims." Yassir nodded weakly, his throat too dry to respond. The elder handed him a bowl of water, urging him to drink slowly. As Yassir regained his strength, he began to recount what had happened. He spoke of the expedition, the buried village, the carvings, and the horrors that followed. His voice trembled as he described the devourer, its monstrous form, and the way it had claimed his friends. The elder listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Yassir finished, there was a long silence. "You encountered Al-Thalab," the elder finally said, his voice heavy with reverence. "The devourer. It is an ancient force, older than the desert itself. Many have sought its secrets, but few have returned." Yassir stared at him, his heart sinking. "Then it's real? The village? The curse? It's all real?" The elder nodded. "The village you found was once a thriving community, but their greed and hubris led to their downfall. They worshipped the devourer, offering it sacrifices in exchange for power and protection. But the devourer is insatiable. When the offering stopped, it turned on them, consuming their land and their souls." Yassir pulled out the scroll, showing it to the elder. The old man's eyes widened as he studied it, his fingers tracing the faded symbols. "This is a relic of great power," the elder said. "It is both a warning and a weapon. You were fortunate to wield it, but its power comes at a cost." "What cost?" Yassir asked, his voice trembling. The elder didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed the scroll back to Yassir, his expression somber. "You have survived where many have perished. The desert has marked you, but it has also spared you. Perhaps it sees you as its messenger." Yassir didn't know how to respond. The idea of being a messenger for something so dark and ancient was almost too much to bear. The Bedouins guided Yassir to the nearest town, a small settlement on the edge of the desert. From there, he contacted the authorities, reporting his friends as missing. He tried to explain what had happened, but his story was met with skepticism. The ruins of the village, the sinkhole, and the devourer, all of it sounded like the ramblings of a man driven mad by the desert. The search parties found nothing. No ruins, no bodies, no sign that his friends had ever been there. It was as if the desert had erased all traces of their existence. Yassir returned to the city, but he was never the same. He became obsessed with the scroll, poring over its symbols in search of answers. He began to experience strange dreams, visions of the village, the devourer, and the faces of his lost friends. Years passed, but the desert's hold on Yassir never loosened. The whispers followed him wherever he went, faint but persistent. At night, he would wake in a cold sweat, his mind filled with the haunting cries of his friends. He eventually donated the scroll to a museum, hoping to rid himself of its curse. But even then, he couldn't escape. The whispers grew louder, the visions more vivid. In his final days, Yasir realized the truth. The desert had not spared him out of mercy. It had chosen him. The devourer was still out there, waiting, watching, and Yasir was its herald. And when the whispers became deafening, Yasir packed his bags and returned to the desert. No one ever saw him again. Thank you for joining us on this gripping journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more thrilling mysteries, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We appreciate your support and can't wait to bring you more unforgettable stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.